Please help me welcome our good friend Julie Ridge. Julie, please join us, and please welcome back Laurel Schwartz. Come on up, join the conversation. Julie, I'd love your general reflection on the film, but I think even specifically as I was watching, I would love to know about specifically, I guess, mental illness in sports. I felt that played a very interesting element here and connects a little bit illness and sports in general, both films, and how those two elements, as the film described sometimes, go hand in hand. And I'd love your thoughts and reflections, both of you.
There are so many ties and so many strengths that one can pull from playing. And one of the first things I was thinking about that the films have in common is that these are hidden disabilities. And you can't tell by looking at Shamiqua or Laurel or myself that we have any sort of disability. I have bipolar disorder also. And there's so many pieces in the movie that I love where she talks about taking out her rage and her depression and turning all of those things that could have been diagnosed a whole lot earlier and might have gotten help for a lot earlier, but that she poured them into the game. And they did make her a better player. They made her a superstar player. And arguably, some of her strengths on the court are mania and being able to practice that many hours with that intensity isn't normal. It's something that's an extraordinary, almost superpower. And I think when she was speaking with her friend on the couch and said, "My disease is part of what made me great," that was always one of the most moving pieces in the movie for me. And it does make one wonder, were it not for the illness, would she have been so great? And I always think, yeah, she definitely would have been. But it's just all an integral part of who and what she is and what makes her who she is. Like the color of her eyes and that fabulous height and that superpower.
Laurel.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think, too, I loved your film. I'm a fan already. But I think that part of my thought in incorporating running into it was I was post-college. I grew up in a family of runners, but post-college really took on long-distance running. And I've had a lot of conversations with people. I think because you can't see my particular disability, where people ask me oh, what's it like to live your life day to day, what must that be like? And when I started logging mile after mile after mile and sometimes feeling oh my goodness, this is never going to end, when am I ever going to get to the end of this, that's kind of when I started to contextualize oh, this physical feat I'm trying to accomplish is very similar to this day after day after day thing that I'm doing with my life. That being said, I'm not a pro athlete. I'll never be a competitive athlete. I'm only competitive against myself. But there is something to kind of how do you, for me it's more of a metaphor than necessarily something that has had a big effect on my life in terms of athletics, if that makes sense.
And totally, and I'm watching both films again, deepened the connection I feel between the two of them for me, and I'm glad that we paired it in this way too. I wanted to ask you, Julie, just more about specifically, I guess, bipolar disorder and mental illness as far as its depiction here, and obviously every case is different. What do you think is unique about this case? Did you find anything unique about this case, or you're you could have diagnosed this a mile away?
It's really funny. You give me too much credit. I didn't make this movie. Rick Goldsmith did. I've seen it, and I'm on the selection committee, and I sort of stepped in because the director couldn't make it. But thank you. I wish I
love
had
it
made
nonetheless.
And I was a pro athlete in the 80s, and I've swum the English Channel, and I feel as though we have a lot in common. But back to...
Me too.
I just took my DSM-5 exam, so...
No, it's okay. I'm delighted to meet the director and the star of the other movie, and I think they're such a perfect pairing. Any illness, whether it's cancer or asthma or diabetes or bipolar disorder or Crohn's disease, is unique and particular to the person who has it. And my bipolar is different and the same as Shamiqua's. And we have criteria that makes it that disease, but it is unique unto us. And my experience of it on a day-to-day basis is different than others. I loved Shamiqua's because her journey, it does take 7 to 10 years to properly diagnose bipolar disorder. It's really tricky to diagnose. And if it's masked by being a superstar and being able to plow all of that energy into something else, we're not going to detect it easily. And if you are culturally and athletically in a position where you can't show weakness, you can't ask for help, then it's going to take even longer. So her 10-year journey to the right diagnosis was long. But when I first saw the movie, I knew she had bipolar almost from the beginning of the movie, because I saw the hints and the symptoms, and when I look back on my life, I wasn't diagnosed till I was 35. But now at 61, I look back on my life and it was there when I was 9. So it's interesting to be able to see looking back. And if there's anybody else in the house with bipolar or depression, you probably nailed it really early in the movie too. But again, it is unique to everyone who has it, meeting the criteria for the illness.
Sorry, can I, just
Yes,
to
please.
piggyback on that, one thing I was thinking about too, in her case is, and something I think I touch on, or I try to touch on in my film, is this idea of like, what happens when you have an invisible disability, but you appear completely functional, and not even functional, but like excelling in a very particularly interesting way. Like a lot of things kind of came to head for me, even though I was diagnosed at 9, came to head for me towards the end of my college career when I was turning in my thesis. I was, getting job offers and graduating with honors and all of that. And how do you create space when you're supposed to be reacting to like success one way, and in reality in your personal life maybe dealing with like a lot of other different things that I think is something that we both films kind of make a space to talk about.
No, and I love the way she put it. She said, I had to wear that mask, and I couldn't. But a lot of people do that. If you're dealing with grief and you have to be, when somebody asks you how you're feeling and you really feel like crap, I mean, most of the time you're not going to say, I feel like crap, because that will necessitate a conversation. And if it's not one of your close, even if it's a close friend, you may not really want to talk about it. But in sports, there's no allowance for that. And I think she really was the female Michael Jordan. She was something, and there may be real Shamiqua Holtzclaw fans in the house. When she was coming up, this woman was astonishing, and she still is, and she still is. She was everywhere. So it's even that much more of a burden to just appear normal and to be humble. I loved her humility, and just what a sweet, kind woman she is.
And beyond that, and this is, I guess, my last question before we open it to questions from the audience and comments from the audience, and to be a part of this conversation. One of the things that actually also connects both of these films is we're talking about a lifelong illness, and how that's something that's just part of this is part of an experience, and this is a part of who you are. And by telling these stories, what an important impact both this film, I mean, Shamiqua didn't make the film, but is speaking out and wrote the books and is definitely outspoken on the topic, and your film too. I mean, yeah, of course, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who do not come out about their illnesses, and there's a lot of stigmas in our society. And by becoming advocates and by telling the stories, I think you're creating change. I think this film, Shamiqua, is speaking out and very brave to come out in with a lot of elements that I think are playing against her. I mean, it's hard being a star. It's hard being in the position that she's in, and to be very brave to come out with all of this is hopefully going to have an impact on other people and allow them to come out with it too and feel accepted with it.
Yeah, I think so. A very brief story that I always just like telling. I grew up, starting when I was very young, going to a camp specifically for kids who have Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And it was a place once a week or once a summer that you went for a week, and I just loved it. And they have doctors and nurses, and for a lot of people, it's the first time they ever meet someone else who potentially has an autoimmune disorder. This past summer, I went back as a counselor for the first time, and I was a counselor for a group of 13-year-old girls, and there were several girls in my cabin who had never told anyone outside of their friends or family that they had Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, and by the time they left, almost every single one of them was like, maybe I'll tell someone. And one of my favorite things that happened after camp was, they all added me on Instagram and whatever. And I looked, and several of them in their bio, because it's a thing when you're 13 to have a little description of like, I play softball and do all these other things or whatever. And several of them were like, I play softball and like YouTube. I have IBD. And that was a change and something new for them. And I think that, certainly having those in-person interactions are super important, and that's part of why I've taken the festival route for this, which is like to have the in-person conversation. But I'm hopeful that a film like this, and I know of a lot of other content creators out there who are doing similar work, that it can create the space to have those conversations and have that support for people when they can't go to camp or when they can't have an in-person interaction. And I'm really hopeful that it's just something that people can see and know that there are other people who are going through a similar thing.
Right, and it's not, I mentioned this earlier, this film is not just, you mentioned Crohn's for one moment in your film, but it's not about Crohn's. It's the same thing that I think the second film covers. It's about lifelong illness and how to get through the day-to-day and everything that's also around it. That's such a bigger picture than just that. I'd love to take any questions, comments, thoughts. Please do share. We'll pass a microphone around. Thanks, Sabrina.
In Shamiqa's story, she had a terrible childhood. She had a mother who was an alcoholic and wasn't there for her. She had a father who, she went through a circumstance and he was schizophrenic. She had a lot of deaths. Luckily, she had a supportive grandmother, but her childhood was horrible, so she did not have anyone around. In a family, I think you did not have that. I think you had a good family, right? And so,
You're great.
well, I'm saying, so I
Are they
think,
here tonight? Are they here?
No, they live in Minnesota.
but I'm saying, so I mean, I wonder how much that contributed, one, to her not dealing with it earlier, and two, maybe increasing the impact of it because she was all alone. So that's a question I would add. So what did she have other than basketball?
I think I wish she were here, and I'm trying to think of, because I did hear her speak, and I want to think of what she said in terms of that. I think we find support where we have it, and where her mother failed her and where her father was very ill. She had a grandmother who gave her undying, unconditional love. And she had very, very good friends. And because of the strength of character and her, there's something really special about her as a person. I think she found that in her friends. So she took things that would break other people, and they made her stronger. And she did pour them into basketball, and you saw those clips from when she was tiny, and she was running loops around people. So she took, again, what would have been a travesty or something that would put somebody else back and just poured it into what she loved. Not everybody's a great basketball player. She has a true gift. I mean, she's truly a gift. So she was lucky that she had the support network, and she had a real, honest to goodness talent that showed itself young, so she could combine that. But I agree with you, and what horrible odds, and still. There was,
There's so much negativity and so many prejudices surrounding women and emotion and anger and hormones and all the various assumptions and presumptions that can be made. Do women actually are women more often bipolar or not?
I'm trying to remember what the odds on that are. I think it's pretty even. I think it affects both. I think that women, depending on if you're in sports, they won't get help. But depending on what you do, I think women seek help more often. And schizophrenia, the age of onset is different for men and women, but it does seem it's an equal opportunity disease.
Very kind.
What do you think of the fact that the movie seemed to play down to the point of evading and avoiding sexual identity issues and how that plays a part in her seeking help and in playing out her conditions? I mean, the film was, to put it kindly, coy.
It was, and she's definitely gay, and she's married now, and she's and I wish they had talked about that a little bit more. It was just sort of inferred. I have a feeling. Again, I don't know, because when I heard the director speak, he didn't address it, and no one put it quite that beautifully. Maybe they felt as though culturally she had enough. Mom was a drunk. Dad was a schizophrenic. She grew up in the projects. Let's not throw this one in, too. And I know that when they make narratives of lives like this, they feel as though if they put all of that in, nobody would believe it. But this is a documentary, and of course you would believe it. I wish I knew the answer to that, and I do wish they had at least just, although we knew definitely she had a girlfriend. It wasn't like they were
It's
screwing.
mentioned,
Yeah,
but you're
it's
right,
mentioned,
that it's
but you're
not,
right. Yeah. And maybe because being gay and being bipolar have absolutely nothing to do with each other. So maybe, because I don't know, I think they wanted to stress the bipolar.
And in the context of athletics, it's a big deal.
Well, except in basketball and tennis, and I'm thinking of Nancy Lieberman and Martina Navratilova specifically. In those sports, it's kind of known within the sport that there are a lot of lesbian and gay players. So I know.
Let's take
yeah.
one more question.
Sorry, not a good answer.
I guess I'm someone who comes from people are kind of talking about various issues that are happening in terms of the idea of mental health issues. I guess for me, I come from a neurodiverse perspective and also feminist perspective. And I guess for me, I look at what is called mental illness as an environmental issue, like the idea that sexual identity, race, gender, patriarchy in society, those basically to me are what basically deals with people causing these disturbances in terms of their own experience. So it isn't as though I think that person was diagnosed later in life. It's because they experienced trauma that led to the manifestation of them dealing with these issues. So I don't quite view it in terms of the idea of that because they had a bad childhood, it was just part of an issue. But if you notice during the film, they talked about the idea that when the person had tragedies, that's when they had these issues that manifested. So it's not as though they just had bipolar, it's that they had life challenges that led them to be in crisis, and they didn't have the support growing up or after the grandmother died, and also the idea of leaving out their identity in terms of the film itself is a kind of a big factor of leaving out all these ideas of mental illness. So, yeah, I guess that's basically it, yeah.
I'm confused.
How,
I'm not clear what the question was.
how much of the environmental elements do you think played a part, if I'm understanding correctly?
Okay. And I think this would be true for Crohn's as well. I think that we are genetically predisposed to a bunch of diseases, and we might manifest them and we might not. And I think that stress and trauma will make things worse for anyone, but for someone with an underlying cancer or Crohn's or bipolar, it might pop it into existence sooner. I don't think trauma causes bipolar, but I don't know if that's what you're saying. No, okay.
I don't view the notion of a biological illness as the basis for what people are talking about. That the idea that you can separate people's traumas from their mental states and what they're going through in life because of stress and life circumstances, I don't know how that relates to the idea of biological illness.
That's what I got.
There's other hands, but I
Let's
know
take.
we've got another
I do want to take one more question in the back, Sabrina, if you can. She's going to come around. We just want the microphone so everybody can hear.
I have a feeling you can project, though, and well, oh, here comes Sabrina.
It's been scientifically proven time and time again that yes, the environment does have a component factor to it, but there's a definite chemical component to it, absolutely. And there's a hypothesis that's going back 30, 40 years called the oncogene hypothesis. You're shaking your head, but that says that we're all kind of predisposed to certain things, and when we're put in the correct environment, things change. And now we know that the things that change are basically our chemicals inside due to our genetic components that cause our body to make certain chemicals, which is why some drugs work for some people and not others. And it's because we have our own, you're shaking your head and looking away, anyway.
We're all
So
entitled
there is a very strong chemical component to that, even though, in your case, for example, your family probably made it better for you because the environment was such that it was an accepting, loving environment. But for a lot of people, it's not. And those are the people that usually tend to be, that don't respond well to medication or who find treatment much more difficult.
Yeah, and I guess too, just to kind of throw one other thing into there, so Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disorder that causes inflammation throughout your body because it's an immune response to your immune system is overactive. It's very much a physical condition. That being said, there's a component, and I should also preface this with my dad is a gastroenterologist and my mom is a nurse. I grew up in a family where healthcare is at top of mind all the time, just out of sheer coincidence. But so I had access to things that other people don't necessarily have, and education that other people didn't necessarily have, and an understanding of how to navigate the medical system in a way that most people do not have. That being said, from the very beginning of when I was diagnosed as a young kid, mental health was also thrown into the picture of, this is something that's difficult to deal with. This is something that will need mental health support. And I started seeing a therapist very early on and still occasionally see a therapist because I consider that part of my health care when I'm looking at how to best take care of my body. That includes how to best take care of my mind. And that's incredibly important to me. And I think that, we can take away whatever we want about how and why different people get different mental illnesses and to different extremes, but the fact is that it is a conversation that we need to have, and it's something that we need to make more accessible to mental health care in general to people who need it.
May I just add one more thing?
Please.
Okay. I want to tie something that you said, and the gentleman there, and the gentleman over here, and the lady up there.
So everybody,
Shamiqua,
we're tying this all together.
Trying to pull it all together because I know we're going to cut it off soon. Shamiqua and I both have bipolar disorder. We both went through a lot before it was diagnosed. I am blessed. I had an intact family. My dad did suffer from depression, but nobody was an alcoholic. I did not have a traumatic upbringing. I had a blessed upbringing. And it didn't change the trajectory of my disease. I had symptoms of it when I was 9, and it was not triggered by a traumatic event, and living through trauma didn't cause my bipolar. So no matter where we come from or what kind of upbringing we have, again, if you're born with the genes for cancer, don't smoke. And if you know that it's in your family, it's a strong interplay, a complex combination of a lot of different factors that lead to whatever expresses itself. And thank you.
I want to thank you all. I want to thank Julie and Laurel for being here and sharing and enlightening this conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Up next here at 9 p.m., our late night screening on the Upper West Side. We have Mad to Be Normal. So please join us for that. And tomorrow, another full day of screening. So please help spread the word. Thank you very much.